All right, so the first piece I'm gonna go over is called Stick to Devotion / Something to Stick. I made a lot of these works over the course of quarantine, which I'm sure everybody for the most part has been in the house for the past 3 or 4 months, and this was the start of mine. It was a pretty turbulent period for me, so I decided to illustrate some of that using big sort of splatter paint with big old ink. As you guys saw with some of the work in progress video as well, I took some of my aggression about quarantine out on the frame of this work. It was one of the first times where I started actually getting comfortable sort of not creating very stagnant, perfected, design-heavy work. Instead, I stuck to what I knew, which happened to be some of the music that I'd been listening to. At the time, it was things like Grover Washington. At the times, it was things like LTD. So I also decided to take inspiration from some of their albums from the 70s and use them here. As you can see in the center, there's Grover. I decided both of their albums, because they're so intimate and display especially like black men in forms of vulnerability, I decided to take that vulnerability, especially at the start of quarantine, and sort of flip it a little bit. Really analyzing some of the healthy and unhealthy ways that we all experience and show vulnerability. For me at the time, especially at the beginning of quarantine, I realized maybe it's kind of unhealthy. So I started, at least the forms of vulnerability that I show. So I started thinking about what things do I stick to? Art. How do I flip the way that I look at art? And the best way, honestly, was to deconstruct the way that I make images. So thought that this would be a really nice way to start. Heavy yellow is also used here because it sort of symbolizes, in a lot of imagery, it symbolizes things like prosperity and wealth. And I thought it'd be interesting to sort of paint over that and display what happens when you start to see things like prosperity and wealth in the ways that we saw it before collapse. So let's move on to the next piece. About a month or two in is really when things started to change a little bit for me. I wasn't necessarily thinking in the overly turbulent way that I'd started off. I started to get a little bit of my footing, and I started looking at the 70s and 80s again. And I feel like one of the most important cultural relics, especially for Black people during that time, was Soul Train. So for me, I decided to look at one of the most important segments of Soul Train called the Soul Train Scramble and sort of illustrate how I felt during quarantine, which my soul felt a little scrambled, not gonna lie. I've always found this tale about the Soul Train Scramble interesting, where they essentially fed contestants the words, or like taught them or told them how to spell them behind stage, essentially so that made the contestants look better. But I found it interesting maybe to take that and to illustrate someone here, a Black femme, stopping themselves from completing the word self-preservation. Again, I'm thinking back and sort of like going back to the first image of how do we all sort of self-sabotage, especially at a time like this. It was a time again where I started looking at old habits and trying to figure out, hey, how do I leave that behind? And also, what can I bring from the past to the present that'll make me stronger in the future? That's when I started leaning more so again. I started leaning back into sort of my design principles that I sort of left behind with the first piece. Again, just like re-examining things, going back to the past and bringing some of it to the present for clarity. I also put it on a mirrored image because I thought, or a mirrored surface, because I thought it would be interesting to take something that's usually looked at as a form or for a form of vanity and using it more so as a form of self-reflection, not necessarily in an overly negative way, but how are healthy ways that we can critique ourselves and one another. And that led me into month, let's say 2 of quarantine, which honestly felt like one of the longest ones. That's when I feel like more than just quarantine, we started seeing more social change become prominent in the U.S. Again, there was still scarcity in terms of supplies that you could pick up at the store, such as like toilet paper, water. Everybody was baking bread, so I decided to paint some. Even down to things like bleach. This was a point where I started to examine prosperity in a different way. In each image, I really tried to create things that honestly I don't get to see often, or anymore, period. One of those things, for me at least, was a Black feminine person that was prosperous. I honestly don't get to see that often, especially depicted by someone that's also Black and femme. For me, prosperity, especially right now, looked like security. It looked like thinking ahead. That's why this piece is called Think Ahead. So this symbol that you'll see in the upper left-hand corner, it's an Ankara symbol that quite literally means forethought or foresight. So it's about thinking ahead, thinking towards like your next steps. For me, next steps are things like preserving, which is why this person is holding preserves. They're making sure that in the future there is something to come. There's also a not so menacing, but to an extent protective cat in the corner. At times, things like purple and green not only symbolize things like prosperity, but also like royalty. Again, there's also a sense of protection using those colors. So that's a part of why you'll see like heavy purple right there. I decided to also add things like greenery because it's a part, to me, adding in things like greenery is a part of like you watering or nurturing something, making sure that you're always rooted. And I'm sure I typically get questions about like these eyes, these like kind of foreboding eyes looking in. And to me, that's someone that's looking in almost in a disruptive manner, trying to almost disrupt all this prosperity that you see. And yet again, this person is so nonchalant, looking off as though they're prepared for anything. They're ready because they thought ahead. Again, as an artist, this piece was very personal to me because you can try and predict as much as you want, especially with art, or try to have prepared as much as you did, especially for this pandemic. But this was this was definitely something where none of us could have prepared for what happened. So it was again another point of self-reflection, another point of what can I do for the future. All this has happened. Our sort of like perspective markets have changed. How do we think ahead as artists, specifically, mostly speaking to other Black femmes? How do we prepare for the future? What does that look like for us? So yeah, this was Think Ahead. So for me, an interesting story that I always received, and I especially needed during this time, was about the fact that when you were born, especially if you're Haitian, your grandmother or the matriarch of your family essentially plants a tree for you, or they essentially like plant something in their garden for you. As you grow up, you eventually are supposed to revisit it. It's essentially supposed to be a point of rootedness, of prosperity, of reflection. Growing up though, one thing that I had to confront, especially about 10 years ago now, during that massive earthquake, was the fact that many of the people that I knew growing up lost their trees. They lost those roots, which I tried to show through sort of chopped down sugarcane that you'll see sort of framing that person's face. It was also one of the first times, again, going back to 10 years ago, that I had to confront people taking advantage of the loss of roots, which is why you'll see a red cross hanging over that person's head. There were several organizations at the time that sort of like took advantage of so many people being in a state of vulnerability. So it's very interesting that now I feel like a lot of Americans are sort of, not to say that I'm not one, because I was definitely born here, but a lot of American people are having to confront that state of vulnerability for the first time, and I think it's again an interesting time to view what happens when your roots are gone in a way. What do you do then? Which leads me down in the image to this portion of almost, I'd say, prayer. One thing this upper portion I'd say more so has to do with being uprooted, and this bottom portion more so happens to do with becoming planted again. So both of my grandmothers had gorgeous gardens in the U.S., or still do. So they probably hurt me for saying that they don't, so they still do. But these gorgeous gardens to me represented them rerooting. It's all about rerooting, becoming more flexible, becoming more vulnerable, and again, like understanding yourself. So I thought it was important to ask the question of, do you understand? Whatever that means to you, do you understand? So yeah, that was me. For a few reasons, but I ended up with essentially like catch a spider by the toe. Growing up, I was always told stories, West African like folklore, and my favorite stories were about Anansi, the spider. But not just a spider. If you're not familiar with Anansi, he was a trickster, a shapeshifter, also a dad, interestingly enough. I had to use whatever resources I could during quarantine, even though it was the last, I'd say month or so of quarantine for me when things began opening back up. One of my struggles was even finding paints. And so I started using things like refurbished bags. I started using twine that I had at home. I started using scraps from different pieces. I completely tore pieces apart in order to make this piece. It was important for me to talk about Anansi during a time like this for a few reasons. Again, the main one essentially being the fact that towards the end of quarantine, we saw more and more Black people being killed, just to put it bluntly, being killed, and that was shared pretty widely. It was one of those things where in trying to apply to different artists, not retreats necessarily, but different artist opportunities, one of the things I kept seeing come up was share your feelings about it, talk about it, create about it. And my struggle was honestly in creating Black Death again. I couldn't do it. But what I could do was talk about experiences being Black and femme and young, and how maybe you are tricked in one way, but that by other people at times trying to help you, they actually end up hindering you. The fact that we're all entangled in that web and we all have things that we need to unpack in that way, which is why you'll see two larger hands reaching down to help somebody that is entangled and has Anansi by the leg, but their hands are trapped as well. Again, I think it's important. It was one of those things where it was one of the last things I really wanted to unpack during quarantine before I released myself and my work back into the world. And that was really, again, just coming back to how are we all confronting this really turbulent, ever-changing time? Are you malleable or are you caught in the web? A trickster can only really trick you if you're not willing to actually change. So, anyway.